The most influential jet fighter of the 20th century never shot down a single aircraft, never fired a single burst, never spent a second in the air. It did not exist. And yet you have seen its outline hundreds of times, in the sky over Korea, on Soviet airfields, in museums on both sides of the Iron Curtain. It simply went by other names. In the spring of '45, the Allies walked into the German design bureaus and found drawings that left the engineers' mouths dry. The documentation was carried off by the ton, in secret, in a race. Yesterday's Allies very nearly came to blows over the papers of one single project, and for almost half a century afterward pretended that nothing had happened. Why did the designers of the most famous Soviet machine deny the obvious to the end of their days? Why was the name of the man who sketched the future of jet aviation struck out of the official histories? And what exactly were the Allies in such a hurry to lock away in their safes, barely across the threshold of a ruined Reich? Watch to the end. You will learn how an aircraft that lost its own war, while still on the drafting board, won a far longer battle for the sky of the entire planet, and why, even now, people speak of it through clenched teeth. The spring of 1945. The Third Reich is coming apart at the seams, and Allied armies, having pushed deep into Germany, are entering cities that only yesterday were sealed behind lock and key. They seize more than factories and warehouses. They seize the design bureaus. And there, in dim offices buried under dust and scorched plaster, the real discovery begins. Drawings lie on the desks. Not blueprints for small arms, not plans for tanks. Drawings of aircraft the world had never seen. Picture the faces of the American and British engineers in that moment. Men who believed they knew everything about aviation unroll the yellowed sheets of drafting paper, and they cannot trust their own eyes. In front of them are machines that leapt years ahead of their time. Swept wings, jet engines, shapes that would not reach the production line until the '50s. This relates to a simple fact. While the Allies were stamping out thousands of piston fighters, German engineers were already drafting the future. One project silenced the experts. It was called the Focke-Wulf Ta-183 Huckebane. On paper, it was a jet fighter with no equal anywhere in the world. Not an upgrade, not another attempt to catch up with the enemy. It was a jump across an entire generation of technology. And the most unsettling part, it very nearly made it. What kind of machine was this? Where did it come from in a country already choking from a lack of fuel, metal, and time? Who stood behind these lines on the drafting paper? And why did his name later vanish from the official history of aviation? This relates to the sharpest question in the whole story. How did an aircraft that never flew a single combat mission manage to leave its imprint on the jet aviation of half the planet? The answer to these questions is hidden in the final months of the war, in the chaos of a collapsing Reich, and in the hunt for German technology that the victors launched the moment the surrender was signed. Captured Ta-183 drawings scattered across different countries. They were studied in Moscow, in Washington, in London. And just 3 years later, an aircraft appeared in the sky at which Western specialists caught their breath. But that comes a little later. First, we have to understand why Germany found itself in a position where its only hope was a fighter that existed only on paper. By the end of 1942, something had happened in the headquarters of the Luftwaffe that no one dared to say out loud. The sky over Germany no longer belonged to Germany. Not long before, German fighters had dictated the rules over Poland, over France, over the English Channel. Now, above their own cities, they more and more often found themselves in the role of the pursuer. This relates to a simple and merciless law of war. Whoever controls the air, sooner or later controls the ground beneath it. The Americans bet on daylight raids by heavy bombers. The Boeing B-17, nicknamed the Flying Fortress, came in tight boxes of several hundred machines at once. Each of those bombers carried up to a dozen heavy machine guns and bristled with barrels in every direction. The British took the night. The Avro Lancaster and its kin arrived in darkness and dropped thousands of tons of bombs on German cities in a single raid. By day, one force. By night, another. There was no respite. The numbers of this aerial siege read like a verdict on the industrial might of the Reich. By 43, Allied aviation was counted in the tens of thousands of machines, and the assembly lines in the United States and Britain were accelerating month by month. Germany simply could not answer in kind. A single enemy bomber brought down over Hamburg or Cologne was instantly replaced by two new ones rolling off an American plant. This relates to the central problem of the Reich. It was not about the skill of the pilots, but about pure arithmetic, and the Germans were losing it outright. The piston fighters on which German defense rested were superb machines. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 fought through the entire war and remained a dangerous opponent. The Focke-Wulf FW 190 was considered one of the best fighters of its class in the world. But against a dense formation of flying fortresses bristling with machine guns, even the best piston fighter operated at the very edge of its limits. To reach firing range, a pilot had to break through a wall of lead. Many did not break through. Add to this one more detail that people prefer not to recall. The longer the war dragged on, the fewer experienced pilots Germany had left. The old masters, who had passed through Spain and the early years of the war, were gradually taken out of the fight. Their seats were filled by yesterday's cadets, who, because of the fuel shortage, could not be properly trained in time. This relates to the very vicious circle the Reich found itself in, losing machines and men faster than new ones could be prepared. The Allies understood perfectly well what they were doing. Their strategy was calculated and cold. First, drive German aviation out of the sky. Then destroy factories, oil refineries, and transport hubs without punishment. By the start of 44, this scheme was working at full force. German industry was still producing equipment in enormous quantities, but it did so under constant blows from the air, losing time, resources, and skilled workers. This relates to what is usually called a strategic dead end. You can still fight, but you can no longer win. It was in precisely this setting, when every new day brought reports of ruined districts and toppled factory chimneys, that a thought was born in the Reich Air Ministry that in peacetime would have looked like a gamble. If the enemy could not be crushed by numbers, then he had to be surpassed in quality. Not by percentages, but several times over. Not another piston fighter, but a machine from an entirely different era. A jet, swift, capable of returning to the German sky what had been lost. And so, in offices buried under casualty reports, the task began to take shape that the design bureau of Kurt Tank would soon receive. In the summer of 1944, the Reich Air Ministry put into words something that can only be called an act of desperation. The program was given the name under which it entered history: the Emergency Fighter Program. In the German original, it sounded dry and official, but behind the bureaucratic wording stood a simple idea. The Reich needed an aircraft capable of turning the situation in the air around in one stroke, not 20% better than what already existed. Fundamentally different. This relates to the moment when the German war machine stopped hoping for gradual improvement and began to demand a miracle. The terms of the competition read like an ultimatum to its own designers. The machine had to be a jet. It had to reach a speed unattainable for the Allies' piston fighters. It had to be built from materials the Reich still had enough of, steel and wood, rather than scarce aluminum and strategic alloys. It had to be assembled quickly, at small enterprises scattered across the country and hidden from raids. And all of this in the shortest possible time, because Germany no longer had any other kind of time. A jet, fast, cheap to produce, available at once. The very statement of the task was internally contradictory, and any engineer understood it. The designers were required to deliver maximum novelty and maximum simplicity at the same time. Advanced aerodynamics and primitive materials, a jet engine, and assembly at near-handcraft facilities, the speed of a future aircraft, and the cost of an everyday one. This relates to the fundamental paradox of the entire emergency program. The Reich demanded a breakthrough out of nowhere, with neither the time, nor the resources, nor the calm home front where such breakthroughs are usually born. In the autumn of '44, the assignment officially went to the design bureau of Kurt Tank at the Focke-Wulf Company. On paper, it looked like an honorable state contract. In essence, it was a sentence with an open execution date. Tank and his people were to design a combat machine of a new generation in a country where factories were bombed daily, communications were torn apart, fuel was vanishing, and the ranks of qualified specialists were thinning. A designer's working day was more and more often interrupted by the wail of an air raid siren. This relates to the particular atmosphere in which the Ta-183 was created. The drawing was born not in the quiet of an office, but to the accompaniment of a country collapsing all around. The stakes in this game were as high as they could be. A successful emergency fighter could, in theory, slow the rout, win back part of the sky from the Allies, buy the Reich a few months. And a few months in that situation were worth a great deal. In that time, other projects might arrive, the balance might shift, a chance for negotiations might appear. The German leadership clung to such calculations as to a straw. The designers, meanwhile, were cast in the role of those obliged to turn the desperation of the top into concrete tons of metal capable of taking off and fighting. No one held any illusions about the timeline. Time was working against Germany openly and brazenly. Every week brought the front closer to the heart of the Reich. Every month reduced the chances of bringing any new machine to series production. The designers understood that they were competing not so much with the enemy's engineers as with the calendar. This relates to the main engine of this whole story. The Ta-183 was designed in the mode of a race where the finish line was rushing forward while the start had hardly been given. It was under exactly these conditions that the work was taken up by a man whose name had by then already become a synonym for German fighter aviation. Kurt Tank was born in 1898, and by the time he was charged with saving the German sky, an entire era of aviation already lay behind him. He had lived through the First World War, trained as an electrical engineer, passed through the cavalry and the trenches, and in the 20s he came into aircraft design when it was still more an art than an exact science. This relates to an important detail of his biography. Tank was no armchair theorist, but a man who understood war from the inside and designed machines for those who would have to fight in them. Real fame came to him in the 30s. Heading the design work at the Focke-Wulf Company, Tank created what would later be called one of the best piston fighters of the war, the FW-190. The machine turned out powerful, durable, and surprisingly simple to service, which in field conditions was valued no less than speed. The FW-190 fought on every front, chased Allied bombers, struck ground targets, and earned respect even from the enemy. This relates to a key trait of Tank as a designer. He knew how to make weapons that worked not on paper, but in the mud, the frost, and the chaos of a real front. His particular talent was considered to be the ability to find a simple solution where others drowned in complexity. Tank did not care for elaborate designs for the sake of elaboration. He started from the assumption that the aircraft would be assembled by ordinary workers, serviced by ordinary technicians, and taken into the sky by ordinary line pilots, not by a handful of chosen test flyers. This engineering philosophy, reliability, manufacturability, common sense, set him apart from many colleagues caught up in pure theory. This relates to why he, of all people, was entrusted with the most desperate order of the emergency program. In a hopeless situation, the bet was placed on a man known for squeezing results out of limited means. Tank had one more feature, rare among designers of that time. He flew himself. He did not merely attend the tests. He sat at the controls of his own machines, took them up and checked in flight what he had drawn on the drafting board. A pilot designer felt an aircraft differently than a pure calculator. He knew firsthand how a machine behaved at its limit, what the pilot experienced in the cockpit, and where the line ran between a bold decision and a dangerous mistake. This relates to the trust the pilots placed in him. Behind Tank's drawings stood a man ready to risk himself just as they did. By 44, his name in German aviation sounded almost like a mark of quality. The factory designation of his machines was even changed in his honor. The letters Ta in the name Ta-183 pointed directly to the designer's surname, whereas earlier Focke-Wulf aircraft had carried the index FW. Few engineers were granted such an honor in their lifetime. This relates to the status Tank had managed to earn. His projects were believed in advance, before the first machine ever rose into the air. And yet even a legendary designer was handed a task by the emergency program that lay at the very edge of the possible. It was one thing to perfect a piston fighter in relatively prosperous years. It was quite another to design a jet machine from scratch in a collapsing country, under bombs, from substitute materials, within deadlines that did not exist. Tank had not to repeat a former success, but to surpass himself in conditions where literally everything worked against him. It is precisely at this point that the whole backstory converges: the weary sky of the Reich, the desperate order from the ministry, and the man who set out to answer it with an aircraft ahead of its time. What it turned out to be on the drafting board, that comes next. What Kurt Tank laid down on the drafting board tore apart every familiar notion of how a fighter ought to look. The age of the straight wing and the propeller pulling the machine through the air was still in full swing. Yet Tank was drawing a silhouette that would appear in the sky in numbers only 10 years later. A short, barrel-shaped fuselage, a sharp nose, a high-mounted swept wing, and an unusual tail assembly. This relates to the central idea of the project. The Ta-183 was conceived not as an improvement on the old, but as a break with everything that came before it. The heart of the concept was a swept wing with an angle of about 40 degrees. In those years, that was almost heresy. Most designers, out of habit, drew straight wings proven over decades. But at the transonic speeds the jet age was approaching, a straight wing ran into an invisible wall of air resistance. Sweep pushed that wall back, letting the machine accelerate where an ordinary fighter would already lose control. This relates to the fundamental breakthrough of the Ta-183. It was designed for speeds for which the old aerodynamics were simply unfit. The wing was placed high, along the top of the fuselage, and that decision too was no accident. The high mounting freed the underside of the machine and improved its behavior at high angles of attack. The tail assembly turned out no less daring. Tank raised the horizontal stabilizer to the very top of the fin into the so-called T-shaped layout. The stabilizer ended up above the flow coming off the wing and worked more cleanly, staying clear of the turbulence. This relates to that very engineering logic of tanks. Every decision served a concrete purpose rather than beauty for its own sake, even though from the outside the machine looked a model of predatory elegance. The engine was hidden inside the fuselage. The bet was placed on the Heinkel HES-011 turbojet, one of the most advanced German jet engines of the time. Air reached it through a frontal intake in the nose, ran along a duct beneath the pilot's cockpit, and exited through the nozzle at the rear, passing through the entire machine. The cockpit, with its teardrop-shaped canopy, was set forward and high, giving the pilot an excellent field of view, a critically important quality for air combat. This relates to a layout that within a few years would become classic for a whole generation of jet fighters around the world. The machine's dimensions were modest, almost miniature for a combat aircraft. A wingspan of about 10 meters, a fuselage length of around 9 meters. A small, light, tightly packed fighter was meant to be both a difficult target and an economical design to produce. The calculated speed reached roughly 950 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 7,000 meters. For 44, when the best piston fighters barely cleared 700, that was a figure from another world. This relates to the very leap in quality the ministry demanded, not a few percent faster, but in a fundamentally different range. A particular pride of the project was its reckoning with the poverty of the war economy. Tank deliberately designed the machine so that its main materials would be steel and wood, with scarce aluminum going only where it could not be avoided. Many components could be made at small enterprises not adapted for complex aircraft construction. Assembly was conceived to be as simple as possible, intended for less than highly skilled workers. This relates to the dual nature of the Ta-183. The advanced aerodynamics of the future coexisted in it with a frankly forced, crisis-driven manufacturing technology. On paper, it all came together almost perfectly. What remained was to find out who else in the Reich was offering their own answers to the same desperate request, and why the choice finally fell on Tank's machine. If you translate Tank's concept from elegant lines into dry figures, the picture grows even more impressive. The calculated top speed of the Ta-183 reached roughly 950 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 7,000 meters. For comparison, not one production piston fighter of that war came anywhere near that mark, running into a ceiling of about 700 kilometers per hour. This relates to the very meaning of the entire emergency program. The Reich needed not an increment in speed, but a full gap of generations, and on paper, Tank provided that gap. No less serious was the range, about 1,500 kilometers. For a light jet interceptor, that was a generous figure, allowing it to meet the enemy far out on the approaches, not only over its own airfields. The combat ceiling climbed to the altitude at which the Allies' heavy bombers operated. The machine was designed not for spectacular records, but for a concrete task: to climb up to meet the tight combat formations, break through to them, and strike before the bomber's gunners could form a dense barrier of fire. This relates to the role the Ta-183 was meant to play in the German defense, the role of a high-speed interceptor fighter. The armament was chosen by the same logic: compact, but extremely powerful. 4 30mm Mk108 cannon mounted in the nose around the air intake. The Germans created these guns specifically against heavy bombers. A heavy shell, a low muzzle velocity, but a devastating effect on the target. A few accurate hits with such shells disabled even a well-protected 4-engine machine. Placing the cannon in the nose, along the aircraft's axis, simplified aiming and removed the need to converge the lines of fire somewhere out ahead. This relates to the simple, hard idea of the designers: one short pass, a dense burst, heavy damage to the target. But the most telling thing in the project was neither the aerodynamics nor the guns, but the philosophy of production. The Germany of '44 was in acute need of aluminum and alloying additives, without which a full-fledged combat aircraft cannot be made. Tank deliberately went against the usual school. Steel and wood became the basis of the structure, and the precious light metal went only into the most critical assemblies. This meant the machine could be built where an ordinary all-metal fighter simply could not be built at all. This relates to the key calculation of the emergency program. What mattered was not an ideal machine, but a machine that could realistically be turned out in the needed numbers. The production scheme grew from the same logic. Instead of one huge plant, an ideal target for raids, a network of small scattered workshops was envisioned. Wooden and steel components could be made at furniture factories, in carpentry shops, at small metalworking enterprises, and then brought together for assembly. The smaller and less conspicuous the production, the harder it was for Allied aviation to knock it out with a single blow. This relates to the bitter lesson the Reich had learned firsthand. Concentrating military industry in large centers made it far too vulnerable from the air. Put all of this together, and you get the portrait of a very unusual machine. On one hand, aerodynamics ahead of the age, a speed out of the future, formidable armament against bombers. On the other, a deliberate refusal of costly materials, a bet on wood, a reliance on near-handcraft assembly by less than experienced workers. The advanced and the forced came together in a single project as closely as happens only under an approaching catastrophe. This relates to the dual essence of the Ta-183, a brilliant fighter of tomorrow, cut to the pattern of a poor, crumbling economy. And yet even such a carefully worked-out concept still had to be defended. The Reich had no shortage of other designers, each with his own answer to the same request, and the decision of whose machine to give the way was made amid heated arguments. It would be a mistake to think that the Ta-183 marched toward victory in proud solitude. The emergency program put almost every leading design bureau of the Reich on its feet, and several firms grabbed at one and the same desperate order at once. At stake was not only state funding and scarce resources. At stake was the honor of a school, the reputation of a designer, and the chance to enter history with a machine that could, in theory, turn the air war around. This relates to the atmosphere of that winter of 44 to 45. At the drafting boards, a struggle was underway no less fierce than the one at the front. Tank's main rival was the project of the Messerschmitt firm, the P-1101. This machine looked like a visitor from an entirely different decade. Its highlight was a wing of variable sweep. The angle could be changed right on the ground, adjusting the aircraft for different flight regimes. In the 40s, such an idea seemed almost fantastical, and the world would return to it in numbers only a couple of decades later, already in the supersonic age. A prototype of the P-1101 was even begun, and later it was precisely this machine that fell into the hands of the Allies, giving them rich food for thought. This relates to how far German engineers looked ahead, even in a hopeless military situation. The Heinkel firm offered its own answer too, the project P-1078. Here the designers took a more cautious and in some ways conservative path, betting on reliability and clear, well-tried solutions. Various layout options were worked through, including unusual schemes with a split nose section. Heinkel had real experience with jet machines behind it, and its word in this argument carried weight. This relates to the alignment of forces in the competition. It was not outsiders facing Tank, but the country's strongest teams, each with its own trump cards and its own engineering school. The Blom und Voss firm climbed even further into the realm of bold experiments with the project P-212. That bureau was famous for its love of unconventional, at times almost heretical solutions, and the jet fighter was no exception. A layout with a shortened fuselage and an extensive tail assembly on booms looked exotic even against the background of the program's other futuristic projects. Such designs stirred the imagination, but carried within them a heightened technical risk. This relates to the key fork of the competition. The Commission had to choose not simply the best project on paper, but the one that could realistically be brought to series production in a collapsing country. And here the hardest part began. Each bureau was sincerely convinced of the superiority of its own machine and desperately defended it before the ministry officials. Calculations, model wind tunnel runs, promises of timelines and performance, arguments about manufacturability and cost. All of it was brought into play. The argument was not only an engineering one, but a political one. Behind the firms stood influential patrons, personal connections, old rivalries, and mutual scores. This relates to the less than ceremonial side of the German aircraft industry. Even on the brink of defeat, a struggle of egos and interests continued inside the field. In this clash, Tank held several serious advantages. His project combined advanced aerodynamics with a sober reliance on poor materials and simple assembly, exactly what the emergency program demanded. Behind him stood the impeccable reputation of the creator of the Focke-Wulf, a machine that had proven itself in real combat. His solutions looked bold but not reckless. A swept wing, a T-shaped tail, a compact airframe. All of it seemed risky exactly as much as the moment required, and no more. This relates to why, in the end, the choice leaned toward the Ta-183. Against more exotic competitors, Tank's machine looked at once daring and achievable. What remained was to await the Commission's formal verdict, and it was not long in coming. In February of 1945, the emergency program's competition came to its resolution. The Commission of the Reich Air Ministry gathered to deliver a verdict on which the fate of several projects depended at once. By that moment, all the materials were on the tables. Calculations, sketches, wind tunnel data, estimates of timelines and cost. Each bureau had already said its final word. This relates to that rare moment in engineering history when abstract arguments over the superiority of one scheme or another had to turn into a single concrete binding decision. The argument was tense. Every project had its supporters, and every one had its critics. Messerschmitt's P-1101 tempted with its variable sweep, but frightened with the complexity and rawness of the idea. The Heinkel machine looked more reliable, but not so daring. The Exotica of Blohm und Voss was mesmerizing, yet it carried too high a technical risk for a country that no longer had any right to a mistake. Against this background, Tank's project kept returning the discussion to a simple question: which of the offered designs could realistically be built and lifted into the air in the coming months? This relates to the main criterion of choice in that situation: not maximum boldness, but a combination of boldness and attainability. On the 28th of February, 45, the verdict was delivered. The Ta-183 won. Kurt Tank's project officially received priority within the emergency program. That date became the formal starting point for a machine that would never be born in metal. A dry line in the minutes set in stone what had recently been only a set of lines on drafting paper. This was the fighter the Reich had appointed as its hope. This relates to the paradox of the whole story. The most important document in the fate of the Ta-183 appeared when Germany already had almost no time or resources left to make use of it. Concrete plans followed the decision, and they looked almost routine against the general catastrophe. The first prototype was expected to take to the air as early as the summer. Series production was scheduled to be rolled out in the second half of the year. To begin with, 16 pre-production machines were ordered, a small batch on which the design was to be worked out, tested in flight, and brought to combat condition. This relates to the normal logic of aircraft building. First a trial series, then mass production. Only there was almost no room left for normal logic in February of 45. The papers promised a clear schedule: prototype, tests, refinement, series. At the meetings, confident timelines and tidy figures were spoken aloud. But beyond the windows of the ministry offices, an entirely different reality was unfolding. From the east, the Red Army was approaching Germany. From the west, the Allies were advancing. The line of the front was tightening around the Reich in a relentless ring. Factories lay in ruins, transport was choking, and there was not enough fuel even for what already stood on the airfields. This relates to the yawning gap between the plans on paper and the state of affairs on the ground. A production schedule was being drawn up for a country that had only weeks left to live. The German leadership still clung to the idea of a wonder weapon capable of turning the course of the war at the last moment. Jet fighters, ballistic projectiles, unprecedented submarines, all of it was presented as a guarantee of a coming reversal. The Ta-183 took an honorable place in this row as yet another great hope. The only trouble was that history had already delivered its verdict on the Reich, and no drawing, however brilliant, could overturn it. This relates to the harsh truth of that winter. While in the offices, they approved production schedules for the aircraft of the future of Germany itself was rapidly shrinking to its last few months. And very soon, all the plans around the Ta-183 were about to crumble beneath the tracks of the advancing armies. March of 1945. Of the great plans of the emergency program, only papers now remained. Germany was falling apart before everyone's eyes. From the east, the Red Army was driving toward Berlin. From the west, the Allies were crossing the Rhine, and the ring around the Reich tightened with every passing day. Factories lay in ruins, railways were severed, cities were turning into rubble. This relates to a simple and merciless fact. A country that meant to build the fighter of tomorrow could no longer feed or arm even its own retreating army. Shortage strangled everything. There was not enough fuel, not enough metal, not enough working hands. Finished aircraft stood on the airfields with nothing to take off on, because there was nothing to pour into their tanks. Under such conditions, even a completed Ta-183 would have remained chained to the ground. The machine of the future ran into the most down-to-earth of all problems: an empty fuel tank. This relates to the bitter paradox of the war's end. The Reich was drawing jet interceptors at the very moment its aviation was choking without kerosene. But there was a blow more treacherous than the lack of fuel: the engine. The entire bet was placed on the Heinkel HES-011 turbojet, and it was never brought to a finished state. The prototypes were temperamental, overheated, failed on the test stands, delivering neither the promised thrust nor the promised service life. Without a reliable engine, the most perfect airframe turned into a beautiful but useless mock-up. This relates to the most vulnerable spot of the whole project. Tank's brilliant aerodynamics depended on an engine that, in essence, did not yet exist in a working form. And then the victors came. In the spring of '45, Allied forces occupied the factories and design bureaus of Focke-Wulf. Everything fell into their hands: drawings, calculations, wind tunnel data, full-scale wooden mock-ups. The documentation was carried off by the ton. The Americans took their share, the Soviet specialists theirs, the British theirs. The hunt for German technology went on without a glance at yesterday's partners in the anti-Hitler coalition, for each was already thinking about tomorrow and about its own superiority in the air. This relates to one of the main trophies of that war: not territory and not gold, but tons of engineering thought that had outrun its time. Kurt Tank himself had no intention of leaving the stage. Fleeing the chaos of a defeated Germany, he later moved to Argentina, where he went on creating combat aircraft, now for someone else's air force. His engineering talent was not lost. It simply changed flags. His brainchild, however, remained a dream on paper. Not one Ta-183 was finished. Not one rose into the air. Not one went up to intercept. The machine's history broke off in the very place where it had begun: on the drafting board. This relates to the sad lot of many of the Reich's brilliant projects. They were late to be born by exactly as much as the very idea of saving a lost war with technology was late. It would seem that this was the end, a magnificent concept crushed by reality. One more unrealized project in the long list of German wonder weapons that never affected the outcome of the war. A museum piece for lovers of alternative history, nothing more. A machine that brought down not a single aircraft, fired not a single shell, spent not a single minute in real combat. This relates to how the history of the Ta-183 looks at a first surface glance, but that was only its visible part. The true fate of this aircraft was only beginning, and it was unfolding no longer in the ruins of the Reich, but thousands of kilometers away, in the design bureaus of yesterday's enemies. What happened next looks more like a detective story than a chapter from a technical encyclopedia. Only 3 years had passed. The year was 1948, and into the sky over the Soviet Union rose a machine at the sight of which many Western specialists involuntarily flinched. It was the jet fighter MiG-15. Very soon, it would become a legend of the Korean War and one of the most mass-produced combat aircraft in history. But the first thing that caught the eye was not that. This relates to the most burning question of our whole story. Why did the Soviet MiG so strongly resemble a German project that had stayed on paper? The likeness was almost demonstrative: a high-mounted swept wing, a T-shaped tail assembly, a short barrel-shaped fuselage with a frontal air intake in the nose, an engine hidden inside the body, and an air duct running beneath the cockpit through the entire machine. Set the layout of the Ta-183 beside the silhouette of an early MiG-15, and an untrained eye will struggle to find a fundamental difference in the overall arrangement. This relates to what made people speak of a direct influence of the German project on the Soviet machine. A coincidence? The designers of the Mikoyan and Gurevich Bureau firmly rejected such hints. "We arrived at this layout ourselves," they said, relying on our own research into the swept wing and on captured engines. And there was a truth of their own in this. Engineers of every major power were working on sweep in those years, and the first MiG-15 took to the air on a British engine, the license for which the Soviet Union had obtained quite openly. There was no direct copying, drawing for drawing. This relates to an important reservation. This is not about a blind repetition of the German machine, but about a far subtler and more interesting phenomenon. And yet the facts are stubborn. The captured Focke-Wulf materials, including the work on the Ta-183, did indeed end up in the Soviet Union. They were indeed studied. Hundreds of German aviation specialists worked in Soviet design collectives after the war, passing on experience, calculations, whole directions of thought. Tanks' ideas did not lie under lock and key. They dissolved into the common cauldron of post-war aircraft building, becoming part of the very environment from which the MiG grew. This relates to the very essence of the Ta-183 phenomenon. It influenced not as a ready drawing to be traced over, but as a concept that sets the direction for an entire school. But the matter did not end with the Soviet Union. Far away on the other side of the world, in Argentina, Kurt Tank himself was building the jet fighter FMA-1AE-33 Focke-Wulf Ta-183, and this machine repeated the outlines of the Ta-183 quite openly now, for it was created by the same man, to the same patterns born in the last months of the war. It came out almost mystical. One and the same concept kept surfacing now in the Soviet sky, now in the South American one, haunting jet aviation like a shadow. This relates to the image that suggests itself, the image of a ghost with no body, yet leaving traces everywhere. Those traces stretched across the whole world. Japanese designers in the 50s, raising their own aircraft industry from the ruins, carefully studied the German jet work of the war years. The Americans, who had carried off their share of the trophies, thoroughly analyzed the captured projects, checking others' solutions and measuring their own against them. A swept wing, a compact airframe, a high speed, what in '44 had seemed a bold German fantasy had, by the early '50s, become the international standard for a jet fighter. This relates to the true scale of the influence of a machine that itself never took off. And so the non-existent aircraft turned out to be almost everywhere. It existed in no metal, yet its ideas, its layout, its engineering philosophy penetrated design bureaus on both sides of the emerging Iron Curtain. The Ta-183 became that very ghost which, for almost 2 decades, was invisibly present in the shape of jet fighters of different countries. This relates to the paradox for the sake of which this story is worth telling. A machine that lost its own war while still on the drafting board won a far longer battle for the future of all jet aviation. So how should the Ta-183 be judged honestly? If you approach it with the cold measure of combat statistics, the verdict will be harsh. It brought down not a single bomber. It fought not a single air battle. Its cannon never once fired at a real target, and its calculated speed was never tested in an actual flight. By every formal sign, this is a machine that, in a sense, never was. This relates to the simplest and most merciless way of measuring a weapon, by what it actually accomplished in the war. But there is another measure. The greatness of military hardware can be gauged not only by the number of victories, but by the force of its influence on everything that came after it. And on this scale, the Ta-183 suddenly rises to the very top. A machine ahead of its time by at least 5 years, a concept so mature that its recognizable features showed through in a whole generation of jet fighters around the world. This relates to that rare type of project which loses in the moment but wins in historical perspective. Aviation enthusiasts still argue over what would have happened had things turned out differently. Imagine for a second an alternative history in which the Reich had had enough time, resources, and a working engine. Squadrons of swift swept-wing interceptors meet the bomber armadas on the distant approaches, force a fight on them at speeds beyond the reach of piston machines, and make the Allies pay far more dearly for every raid. The picture is striking and utterly unattainable. History knows no conditional mood, and the real Ta-183 remained a set of drawings. This relates to a simple truth. A machine must be judged by what it became, not by what it might have been in someone's fantasies. And what it became was something far more enduring than a successful frontline fighter. Today, the Ta-183 itself is remembered mainly by aviation history buffs and collectors. In museums stand copies and models built from the drawings. In flight simulators, it finally flies and fights, making up virtually for what it was denied in reality. But the true legacy of Kurt Tank does not live in museum halls. It lives in the very shape of the modern aircraft. This relates to how an idea, once brought to maturity, outlives both its creator and the state that ordered it. Look at any jet fighter of the second half of the 20th century. A swept wing carried back at a calculated angle, a compact, streamlined airframe, an engine tucked into the fuselage. Behind these features, now grown familiar, stands, among others, the work of a German designer who, in the last months of a lost war, tried to save the sky of his country. He did not save that sky, but he involuntarily sketched the shape of the sky for decades ahead. This relates to the bitter irony of the whole story. Tank's triumph came after defeat and was carried out by other hands, in other countries, under other flags. The Ta-183 Huckabane remained on paper. Not a single example rose into the air, not one went into battle, and its very name has nearly faded from popular memory. But its spirit took flight, on the wings of MiGs, Sabres, and hundreds of other jet machines that plied the sky all over the world. And in this deeper sense, it truly was one of the best aircraft of its era. It is only that its victory came after defeat, its glory went to others, and its true role remained in the shadow of the official histories. Such is the fate of brilliant latecomers. They arrive too early to win, and they linger too long to be forgotten. Here the story of the Focke-Wulf Ta-183 comes to its close, but our conversation about the machines that changed the sky does not end. If this account made you look at familiar fighters with different eyes, support the channel with a like. That simple movement of a finger helps stories like this one reach new viewers. Write in the comments what you think. Was the influence of the German project on the MiG-15 a direct borrowing or a natural coincidence of engineering thought? Your opinion truly matters here. Subscribe to the channel if you are not with us yet, and be sure to tap the bell. That way you will not miss the coming releases about legendary aircraft, forgotten projects, and the hidden pages of military aviation. There are still many stories ahead that people long preferred to keep silent about. Thank you for staying to the very end. Until we meet again in the sky.